business and how hard it is, even as we speak. This is a good place for reference. We've also done many investment climate reforms. Many African countries are paying close attention to the doing business rankings of the World Bank Group and also taking steps to improve the business regulatory environment. We have a long way to go. We're still ranking quite low in many of our countries in this area. We have so many reforms to embark on. But it looks like changing the business environment is taking hold, because the latest doing business report mentions that 36 out of 46 African economies were embarking at least on one reform. Things like facilitating business registration, fast-tracking property permits, enhancing legal protection for investors, and so on. And some of the post-conflict countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone are interestingly countries that are doing very well. And we'll know, of course, that Rwanda, coming out of a long period of conflict, is also one among the top performers in recent years. Improving human development indicators, and overall, the continent's development indicators are trending upwards. I don't think they're doing that fast enough. We will miss many of the MDGs by 2015, but the region has reached about 60% of the target levels for the Millennium Development Goals. But we're not complacent, we're not happy. We think we need to push more so that our human development indicators will improve. In my country, in particular, Nigeria, we have a lot of work to do to improve maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates. It's just not good enough to be growing at a relatively fast rate when your human development indicators are not improving enough. I think it's unacceptable that we should have women die in childbirth when we know the technology, we know the answers, we know what to do, and these are some of the things we must focus on. Looking ahead, I would say that African policymakers need to maintain the good macroeconomic policies which have served us so well in recent years. But then we also need to pay great attention, and we are paying, to creating jobs, investing in infrastructure and in skills, and also tackling the widening inequality. Let me just touch briefly on these problems. I've said what it is we are doing right, we need to maintain it, but there are also things we need to do much better on. Infrastructure. I know we all know about it, so I won't dwell too long, but I have to say that the infrastructure deficit in the power and transport sectors remains one of the binding constraints on economic growth on the continent. To provide some numbers, the sub-Saharan Africa region, with a total population of nearly 800 million, generates only about 2% of the world's electricity output, equal to the total power output of Spain. For roads, we know that transportation costs in Africa are more than twice the corresponding costs in other BRIC economies. Why am I stressing the infrastructure challenges? Well, because overall, it reduces the productivity of African firms by about 40%. Whether you're looking at small SMEs like a tailoring shop down the road or a large industrial manufacturer. The World Bank estimates that overall, Africa's infrastructure deficit lowers the region's economic growth by about 2 percentage points each year. We cannot afford this. For us in Nigeria, we are trying to tackle some of these challenges. For example, by undertaking a sweeping privatization of our power sector and also pursuing various public-private partnerships in our transportation sector. We recently signed an MOU with General Electric to assist in developing power, rail, and healthcare infrastructure, just as an example, with a view to them putting in about 10,000 megawatts of power over the next 10 years. But what is really exciting is the open and transparent manner in which the power sector privatization has been done. All the generating units and the distribution units are being sold, all 17 of them. And only transmission remains in the hands of government, and it's being outsourced. Government is acknowledging that maybe we are not the best to manage this resource and has been outsourced for management to Manitoba Hydro of Canada. We still have a host of problems to solve in making the power sector work well, but I think we are on the path to a very exciting way of approaching this. We've opened up the sector, liberalized it so that people can come in and generate and sell power. And I hope that all this will help us manage the single binding constraint of infrastructure in the country, which is power. In terms of education and skills training, the second challenge which African policymakers must bear in mind concerns investing in skills development of their citizens, particularly for youth. I realized there was one of the conference panel sessions this afternoon discussing this very topic. In a nutshell, the challenge is that the sub-Saharan Africa faces a pending demographic bulge as the size of the youth population is projected to rise. In general, with a growing youth population, the ratio of the non-working age to the working age population, the dependency ratio declines. This results in rising per capita incomes for everyone and is called the demographic dividend. But this dividend only works if you can find jobs, create jobs for this youth. If we are unable to create the jobs, then it becomes a demographic nightmare and not a dividend. What we need to avoid is that nightmare. And we have good examples of this working in the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, over the period 1965 to 1990, and they managed this well. So capturing this demographic dividend requires some careful planning. For example, it will be necessary to invest in skills training for youth and create jobs that fully harness youth potential. McKinsey estimates that some additional 122 million workers will enter Africa's labor force by 2020. And by 2035, the size of the African labor force will be greater than that of any other nation, including China. We therefore need to look ahead and invest in training. We need to work more with industry. We need a partnership between government and industry to create skills in practical areas, technical and vocational skills, for example, professional craftsmen such as welders, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, and so on. Our tertiary education curricula also needs to be more entrepreneurial so that our graduates become job creators rather than job seekers. I will return to this job creation point in the final section of the talk. But I'm really worried about what I call the missing middle in our jobs, that of vocational training. You often find in our countries this lack of this technical skills, craftsmen. In Nigeria, when we need to build houses, we often turn to Togo, to Benin and Ghana to get good craftsmen. You know my joke, and that of my husband who is in the audience, if you're building something in Nigeria, then the person does the wall or the piece of iron and it's a little bit bent, it should be straight, or puts the tile in the bathroom. And then you say to them, but this doesn't look quite right. They say, I'll manage it now. I call it the manage it syndrome. And when you're not prepared to manage it, you don't like mediocrity now. It's too difficult. But we must get away from the manage it syndrome. You know, the worst thing I like to hear is manage it now. Strongly that in our economies we must train for excellence in this category of jobs, and that we have the imperative to do it. How about widening inequality? Before I wrap up this section on economic policy, let me also say a few things about widening inequality. Despite Africa's recent strong growth and the rising middle class I spoke about, many poor households have been left behind, and the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. As the Arab Spring taught us, rising inequality and youth discontent are a volatile cocktail mix that could have serious political consequences. This trend is not peculiar to Africa. In fact, just today, or was it yesterday, I read about rising inequality here. As incomes, I think it was in the New York Times or Financial Times, incomes are increasing here, but they are only growing for the top 1 or 2%. And those at the bottom of the ladder are falling behind. Many fast-growing emerging economies such as China, Indonesia, Brazil are experiencing the same thing. Economists use the Gini index to assess the extent of inequality. This is an index that measures the concentration of household incomes, and a higher index implies higher inequality. To give you some numbers for reference, China with its rapid growth and rising inequality has a Gini index of 42. For Africa, 24 countries have Gini indices higher than China. For Nigeria, the Gini is 49. For Mozambique, 46. For Botswana and South Africa, the index is over 60. So we have to deal with this problem of rising inequality, and I'm very worried about it. So even as we grow, we must find ways and means to try and tackle what is happening at the bottom end of the scale. And I strongly believe that the way to do it is jobs. Of course, in Brazil, President Lula introduced the Bolsa Familiar, which is a program that tries to make transfers to poor households, and that has managed to bring up the bottom in Brazil and to create a social safety net that has helped the country deal with questions of inequality. But in many African countries, you find many policy makers are afraid of such large subsidy programs because they often turn strictly into entitlements. They may become unsustainable and hard to deal with. So we have to devise our own social safety nets and transfer programs which we can manage in terms of sustainability within our budgets. We're trying to do that in Nigeria by creating jobs at the bottom of the scale through a community services scheme, which we started creating 320,000 jobs for youth, unskilled youth in labor-intensive activities per year, 320,000 per year. We've also started a graduate internship program in the country, which is designed to help with unemployed young graduates. And President Goodluck Jonathan, people ask me, what keeps him awake at night? Well, what keeps him awake at night is the issue of jobs, the lack of jobs for youth. And he pushes every minister, your brief is to do what you can to create jobs by working across sectors that have sources of growth like agriculture, housing, etc., but also through some direct activities like the one that we mentioned, and I'll say a bit more about that. Right now, this graduate internship program, I commend it to you because several companies have actually come to me and said they would be interested in getting young people from the diaspora to participate in this. So if you're interested and you're willing to work for quote-unquote minimal wages for a year,